The European Union, an economic union and not a federation, the absence of an army and a true central command. The European Union, EU, represents a unique model of cooperation between states on the international stage. It was founded and developed as an alliance based on principles of economic integration and political cooperation, but it has never taken on the characteristics of a true federation. This distinction is crucial to understanding the structural limitations of the EU, especially in key areas such as defense and security. Unlike a federal state, such as the United States of America or Germany, the European Union does not have a central government with full authority over all member states. This peculiarity has several consequences. There is no European army, no true central command capable of imposing binding decisions on member states, and when conflicts or major international crises occur, the EU's actions are often limited to imposing sanctions rather than carrying out direct and decisive interventions. The European Union, economic union and not a federation. To understand the EU's limitations in military and decision-making matters, it is essential to analyze its political and institutional structure. The European Union was officially established with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, but its roots go back to earlier agreements such as the European Economic Community, EEC, and the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, created after World War II with the primary objective of fostering economic cooperation among European nations to prevent new conflicts. This approach led to the development of a system based on cooperation among sovereign states rather than the creation of a federal structure with a strong central authority. While in a federation, decisions made by the central government are binding for all member states, in the EU, many decisions are made through consensus among national governments, making the decision-making process slower and more complex. In the United States, for example, the federal government controls foreign policy and national defense. There is a single army under the command of the president, who is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In the US, federal states, such as California or Texas, do not have their own armies and do not conduct independent security policies. Conversely, in the EU, each member state retains sovereignty over its armed forces, meaning there is no unified European military force and each government autonomously decides on its defense strategy. This fragmentation is one of the main limitations of the European Union in the global geopolitical context. The absence of a European army, causes and consequences. One of the most evident aspects of the EU's non-federal nature is the lack of a unified European army. Why doesn't the EU have its own army? The reasons for this absence are multiple and primarily stem from the desire of member states to maintain full control over their defense decisions. National sovereignty and military autonomy. One of the fundamental principles of international politics is the concept of national sovereignty, meaning the exclusive right of a state to manage its internal and external affairs without external interference. Defense is traditionally considered a key aspect of state sovereignty, which is why no EU member state has ever been willing to completely relinquish control of its armed forces to a supranational entity. Even the major European powers, such as France and Germany, which are the main proponents of European integration, are reluctant to give up exclusive command of their armies. France, in particular, possesses nuclear weapons and has a long tradition of military independence, while Germany, for historical reasons, has always maintained a cautious approach to defense matters. Strategic differences among member states. EU member states have very different strategic interests. Some countries, such as Poland and the Baltic states, view Russia as the primary threat to European security and advocate for strengthening the EU's military capabilities. Other countries, such as Austria and Ireland, have a historical policy of neutrality and do not want to be involved in aggressive military alliances. This diversity of perspectives makes it extremely difficult to create a common armed force with a shared strategy. The role of NATO. Another crucial factor is the existence of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance led by the United States and comprising most EU member states. NATO guarantees Europe's military protection, reducing the urgency for the EU to develop its own autonomous defense structure. Many European governments believe that a European army could create overlaps and conflicts of competence with NATO, making security management even more complex. The EU cannot impose decisions on member states or third countries. The absence of a strong central command is reflected not only in the lack of an army but also in the EU's limited ability to impose binding decisions on member states or third countries. The limit of sanctions. The EU can impose economic and diplomatic sanctions on states or individuals who violate the principles of international law. However, sanctions are not always effective and, most importantly, they are not a direct coercive tool like military action. A concrete example is the EU's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Union imposed heavy economic sanctions on Russia but could not intervene directly in the conflict because it does not have its own army, and any military action depends on individual member states and NATO. The role of the International Criminal Court, The Hague. The International Criminal Court, ICC, based in The Hague, is an international legal institution responsible for prosecuting war crimes, genocide, and serious human rights violations. However, its power is limited to the cooperation of states. Many countries, including the United States, Russia, and China, do not recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC, meaning its rulings cannot be enforced in these states. Moreover, the court does not have its own police force to arrest war criminals and must therefore rely on the willingness of member states to cooperate. The EU, an economic giant but a political and military dwarf. The European Union is one of the world's largest economic powers, but its political and military influence is severely limited by its non-federal structure. As long as member states continue to maintain full sovereignty over their defense and foreign policy, the EU will never become an autonomous global power capable of competing with the United States, China, or Russia. The European Union and defense, the implications of not being a confederation and the risks in case of military threat. The European Union, EU, is one of the world's leading economic and political powers. However, its institutional structure, based on cooperation between sovereign states rather than a true federation or confederation, presents significant weaknesses in the event of a military threat or a direct attack on one or more member states. This situation arises from the fact that the EU does not have a centralized military command, nor does it possess a single army under a supranational authority. Each member state retains exclusive control over its armed forces, independently deciding defense strategies, military budgets, and international alliances. This means that in the event of external aggression, the European Union's response would necessarily be fragmented, slow, and difficult to coordinate, with potentially disastrous consequences for the security of the entire continent. The European Union and defense, a system based on cooperation, not a unified command. To understand the implications of the lack of a federal structure in the event of a military threat, it is essential to analyze how European defense policy functions. European Union and NATO, two separate structures. Although most EU countries are part of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this alliance is a distinct military structure led by the United States. This means that in the event of aggression, the European Union would not independently decide its military response but would necessarily have to follow NATO procedures and decisions. However, some EU member states, such as Austria, Ireland, Sweden, before its recent NATO accession, Finland, before its recent accession, Malta, and Cyprus, are not part of NATO. This further complicates the possibility of a collective and immediate response. This situation highlights the first major issue, the absence of a unified chain of command and a slow reaction time in the event of an immediate threat. The Common Security and Defense Policy, CSDP, a weak mechanism. The European Union has attempted to develop its own security policy through the Common Security and Defense Policy, CSDP, which allows for joint peacekeeping missions and limited military interventions. However, this instrument has several structural limitations. Decisions must be made unanimously, meaning that any action must be approved by all 27 member states, making a swift response in emergency situations difficult. There is no European army. The CSDP relies on collaboration between national armies, which must be mobilized on a case-by-case and voluntary basis. A lack of common resources. The EU does not have a significant military budget and cannot directly finance large-scale defense operations. In summary, the Common Security and Defense Policy is not a true collective defense instrument but rather a limited coordination mechanism that is largely ineffective in the event of a large-scale attack. The implications of the lack of an effective defense structure in case of aggression. The absence of a military federation or a European army leads to a series of direct consequences for the continent's security. Slow response to a potential aggression. One of the main problems arising from the current structure of the EU is the slow decision-making process in the event of a military threat. Imagine a hypothetical scenario in which a country bordering the EU decides to launch an attack against a member state. In a federal system like that of the United States, the response would be immediate. The federal government would activate the national army, and the entire military apparatus would be mobilized under a unified command. In the case of the EU, however, the situation would be much more complex and confusing. The European Council would have to convene urgently to decide on the course of action. However, foreign and defense policy decisions require unanimity, meaning that a single opposing member state could block any action. Member states would have to decide individually whether and how to contribute to the defense of the attacked state, with no automatic obligation to intervene. If the aggression targeted a country that is not part of NATO, such as Austria or Malta, the European Union would have no automatic mechanism for military intervention, increasing the risk that the affected country remains isolated. The chain of command would be disorganized, as each national army would respond to its own leadership rather than to a central European authority. This slow decision-making process makes the EU appear less credible as a geopolitical and strategic entity, as no potential aggressor would truly be deterred by the prospect of an immediate and strong European reaction. Weakness of Europe's military credibility. The lack of a European army and a centralized command deeply undermines the EU's military credibility. In international relations, deterrence is essential for preventing conflicts. A country is less likely to attack another if it knows that there will be a swift and devastating response. However, the European Union lacks the ability to project a credible military threat because it does not have a unified defense system, so a potential aggressor can calculate that the European response would be slow and fragmented. It lacks a rapid reaction force, meaning it would not be able to respond immediately to an aggression. It relies heavily on NATO, and therefore on the United States, for its security, making it vulnerable to geopolitical shifts in transatlantic relations. The risk of dividing Europe in the face of a crisis. If a military attack targeted an EU state, the other members could struggle to agree on how to respond. Some countries, for instance, might believe that diplomacy is the best solution, while others might push for immediate military intervention. This risk of division is particularly evident among nations with very different geopolitical perspectives. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states have a strong perception of the Russian threat, whereas other nations, such as France or Italy, might be more inclined toward diplomatic mediation. The European Union risks being an easy target in a major conflict. The European Union, in its current form, is an economic powerhouse but a military and political weakling. Its inability to respond rapidly to threats, its lack of a common defense strategy, and its dependence on NATO make it vulnerable in case of aggression. Without real unification of military forces and a strong central command, the EU will continue to be perceived as an entity incapable of defending itself autonomously, with all the strategic implications that come with it.